have full coverage of that. As always here on The Briefing, do get in touch with your views. You can email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. That and so much more over the next hour between 3 and 4. But first, at the top of the hour, here's the news with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, it's just 1 minute past 3. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson's due to speak to G7 leaders this afternoon, before then flying to Poland and Estonia tomorrow as shelling continues in Ukraine. Dozens of people have reportedly been killed and hundreds injured in rocket strikes in the city of Kharkiv this morning. Efforts to broker an immediate ceasefire are currently underway, with delegations from Ukraine and Russia meeting in Belarus. Kiev hopes that the talks will also lead to the withdrawal of Russian forces from the country. President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked the European Union to fast-track Ukraine's membership application.
We
address the European Union to admit Ukraine immediately according to the new special procedure. We are grateful to the partners that they stand with us, but our goal is to be with all Europeans and, most importantly, to be equal. I'm sure that's fair. I'm sure we deserved it. I'm sure it is possible.
Human rights groups are condemning Russia's reported use of cluster bombs on a preschool in eastern Ukraine. 3 people, including a child, were killed at a nursery and a kindergarten near Kharkiv. Another child was injured in the attack. Amnesty International says the use of cluster munitions in a civilian area may constitute a war crime. Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharo told GB News the country needs help in protecting its airspace.
We are not looking for boots on our ground. We are ready to fight ourselves. And we don't ask British people, American people to fight for us. But we ask you to help us to protect the skies. Because the Russians are using aircrafts and missiles to hit residential houses, kindergartens, hospitals, schools.
The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is urging Brits not to travel to Ukraine to join the fight after the Foreign Secretary said she'd support such a move. Former British Army soldier Jason Luck, whose wife, daughter and stepson are all in Ukraine, he told GB News he's keen to sign up.
I consider it my second home, and I was in my daughter, and I don't know what's going on. I can't get hold of her at the moment. I speak to my partner. Her little boy is autistic, and he's got other disabilities. She's not happy about me doing it again. She's been angry about it, but as I said to her, I feel like it's my duty too.
The United Nations Refugee Agency says 500,000 people have fled Ukraine since the conflict started. It follows news that Britain's likely to follow the EU's lead in taking Ukrainian refugees for the next 3 years. The policy is due to be reviewed in the coming days. Boris Johnson has already announced immediate family members can join Ukrainians currently living in the UK. Russia has announced sanctions barring airlines from 36 countries, including Britain, Germany and Canada, from entering its airspace. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss will update the Commons this afternoon on UK sanctions against Russia. Britain has joined the US and the EU in banning financial transactions with the Russian Central Bank, Finance Ministry and Wealth Fund. That's effectively cut Moscow off from Western financial markets. Russia's central bank has now more than doubled its key interest rate to a now unprecedented 20%. It's trying to shore up the ruble, which has fallen to an all-time low against the dollar after sanctions were imposed against Moscow. Well, they include, for example, the blocking of some Russian banks from the international banking system, SWIFT. Fears over energy supplies have seen oil prices soar as a result of the conflict. Petrol in the UK has also reached record highs, with the average price hitting £1.51 for the first time. The cost of diesel is also at unprecedented level. Of course, we're going to be keeping you up to date with all the developments, but now let's turn our attention to some other news closer to home. Commuters here are going to be facing the biggest hike in fares in nearly a decade. Ticket prices in England and Wales are increasing by 3.8%. That follows a similar rise in Scottish rail travel costs last month. Talking of Scotland, coronavirus restrictions have been eased. Mandatory vaccine passports for nightclubs, concerts and football matches have been scrapped. Students and teachers no longer have to wear masks in the classroom. They do still have to wear them in communal areas, though, and distancing rules will still apply. In Australia, 9 people have died. Tens of thousands have been evacuated from their homes after heavy rain brought record flooding to Australia's east coast. The Brisbane River in Queensland capital has peaked, but 4 people are still missing. Parts of the city remain underwater. Flash flooding also remains a serious risk in northern New South Wales. You're now up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you any developments as it happens. Now let's head to the briefing and Darren.
Thanks, Rosie. It is, 6 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Monday afternoon. You're watching The Briefing, an hour of the latest political news and analysis here on GB News, on your TV, online, and, of course, many of you listening on the radio. Now, there are fears this afternoon that Vladimir Putin may intensify his assault on Ukraine's cities amid signs that his invasion isn't quite going as he had hoped. In the last few hours, the Russian state media has reported that the country's defence ministry has put its strategic missile forces and Northern Pacific fleets on enhanced combat duty. That comes just a day after Vladimir Putin put his nuclear weapons on high alert. Well, let's get the very latest of what we can know this hour about what's happening in Ukraine and join our Home Affairs and Security Editor, Mark White. Very good afternoon to you, Mark. First of all, just in terms of where we're at in all of this, again, I was saying that many here in the West feel that this plan, this invasion by Putin, isn't going quite as well as he had hoped. He hoped for a lightning attack that would overwhelm the country, and yet, again, we're into day 5 and the fierce resistance from Ukraine and its army continues.
Well, the Ukrainian military certainly claim that they have killed 4,500 Russian soldiers. We've no way of independently verifying it, but it's an official claim from that government, so we source it that way. And the British Ministry of Defence, who've been doing intelligence analysis on the ground as well, say that they do believe there have been significant casualties inflicted on those Russian forces. So, yeah, it doesn't look as though it's all going Vladimir Putin's way, but there's also the issue that he hasn't used the full might and firepower of his forces against the Ukrainians at this stage yet. We have these peace talks that are underway in Gomel in Belarus. They began a few hours ago. They are still continuing. They've taken a slight break, a short break, we're told, before going into a third session of these talks. Now, look, that has to be at the very least encouraging that they are continuing to talk to each other. The hope would be, obviously, for a ceasefire and a withdrawal. The Ukrainians want the Russian forces to withdraw from Ukraine completely. But even just a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire to allow civilians to get out of harm's way would be welcome. Anything really would be welcome from what we have at the moment. In terms of the situation on the ground, it has been relatively quiet in and around the capital, Kiev. Fighting in some other key areas. Chernihiv, to the north of Kiev, there has been significant fighting. And in Kharkiv, images released by the Ukrainian government showing a bombardment of that city in the northeast of Ukraine. It's only about 20 miles from the Russian border, but they have been putting up a very stiff fight. And the Russian forces have been in and around Kharkiv, trying to get in. They've been repelled multiple times. Now we're told that it came under fire, sustained bombardment, with dozens of people killed, according to the Ukrainian authorities, and hundreds injured. Again, no way of independently verifying it, but that is the claim from the Ukrainian government. The Russian military, for their part, well, they've been pushing in ever further. They've been seen in the Donbass area, around Donetsk, Russian rebel-backed military vehicles. I mean, they look, for all intents and purposes, just like Russian tanks. That's because, effectively, they've been arming the rebel groups in the Donbass area, and they've been pushing forward, making gains in some areas, making not quite so much progress in other areas. So the fighting continues to rage on. As I say, it's been quiet, relatively speaking, in the capital so far. but the refugees are continuing to head towards the border. This is, Darren, a growing humanitarian crisis. The latest word from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is that some 500,000 refugees have now crossed the border of Ukraine into neighbouring countries, Baltic states, including Poland, Slovakia and Romania. 7 million and counting are displaced internally in Ukraine, trying to flee the worst of the fighting, and may well head over the borders in the coming days.
Indeed, and I think there's concern, isn't there, in the Donbass region, Mark, that Ukrainian fighters could get cut off, squeezed by those separatists that they've been fighting for years as Russian troops move in from the south. Just very finally and quickly, if you can, though, on Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. We're expecting to hear from her in the next 20 minutes or so, live in the comments she addresses MPs. The Kremlin today seemed to be suggesting it was her words yesterday in terms of fighters potentially travelling from Britain to Ukraine that may well have sparked off Vladimir Putin up in the ante when it came to putting his nuclear forces on alert. It must be said that Westminster and Downing Street somewhat distancing themselves today from Liz Truss' remarks yesterday.
Yeah, a little bit perhaps, but I think the Russian government are willfully misrepresenting what the Foreign Secretary was saying. She was asked directly in interviews yesterday about the situation and whether we in NATO could be drawn into a conflict with Russia. So answering that question, of course, it is a hypothetical, but given the very heightened state over there, the potential for conflict right on the border with Baltic nations, NATO countries, then there is that prospect. So that's being used now against Liz Truss as, according to the Russians, a justification for why Vladimir Putin came out and really raised the spectre of this nuclear option and saying that his forces are going on to a heightened state as far as their nuclear deterrent is concerned. The other issue, of course, that's raised a few eyebrows was when Liz Truss said that she would understand and support those who wanted to go over and fight for President Volodymyr Zelensky's Foreign Legion to go and defend Ukraine. She said that, and it's been interpreted that various ministers have distanced themselves. Well, sort of. I heard Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, speaking this morning. He said that, of course, there's a travel ban to the region. He doesn't want people to go over there. There's other things they could do in this country to help. But he understands there are feelings running very high and there will be people who go. So he says those who have had military experience, those who've served in the British Armed Forces, if they are determined they want to go, they should contact the Ukrainian embassy for advice, which is what they've been doing. So that doesn't sound like he's completely distanced himself from what Liz Truss said to me.
OK, appreciate that, Mark. Mark White there, Home Affairs and Security Editor, joined us with the latest on all of that. We should say Downing Street have just issued a statement in the last couple of minutes while we've been talking to Mark that the Prime Minister has spoken to the Ukrainian President Zelensky this afternoon. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, commended his bravery and that of the Ukrainian people. The leaders categorically condemned the barbaric airstrikes being carried out by Russia against innocent civilians, including children. And the Prime Minister updated President Zelensky on UK military support being sent to Ukraine and committed to sending more in the coming hours and days. So that's the latest from Downing Street. And I'd say in the studio is the Conservative MP, Michael Fabricant, who joins us. Michael, thank you for joining us. First of all, Mark referred to it there, didn't he, about this refugee crisis that we're now starting to see emerge in Ukraine, 7 million displaced internally, hundreds of thousands fleeing to other countries. Do you think the UK should go as far as the rest of the EU now in saying that essentially Ukrainians can travel to Britain without the need for visas, at least in the short term?
Yes, I do. I mean, obviously, we must make sure that they're not people who would be working against Britain, because not everybody is a bona fide refugee. But yes, I mean, there are 40,000 Ukrainians who currently live in the United Kingdom. We've already said that all the relatives of those 40,000 can come to the UK without visas. And certainly others, yes, I think we should. And indeed, the Prime Minister has said that we intend to do just that. So stand by for further announcements.
So you think that will come in time? Now, you used to live in what was the Soviet Union back in the day. I know you've still got lots of friends who live in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia. And we've seen images today, haven't we, of people queuing up outside ATM machines, clearly fearful the banks might collapse. What are you hearing from them about what's happening internally in Russia at the moment?
Well, we're hearing stories, aren't we, that the government has cut down social media. That's not true. I'm being retweeted in the Russian Federation. I've also been in the Russian Federation since the old days of the Soviet Union. There's huge concern on the nightly news bulletin, Novosti, on the main television channel there. Last night you had a commentator talking about over 4,000 nuclear weapons aimed at the West. Far from actually reassuring the Russian people, who are not stupid, far from it, they are alarmed by information like this. They remember, we call it the Second World War, they call it the Great Patriotic War, when 24 million Russians died. They don't want to see that happen again. They know that if nuclear missiles are fired at the West, nuclear missiles will be incoming into the Russian Federation. And people are beginning to worry because it's not only fear that the banks will collapse. Already interest rates, which were quite high in Russia at 8%, have shot up to 20%. And when I was in Russia, the ruble was worth £1 and threepence, so that was a long time ago. Now the ruble today is 3/4 of a British penny. It's nothing.
Incredible.
And that's going to put costs up, inflation. We talk about cost of living crises here. That's
it's nothing compared to what's in Russia.
Yeah.
What do you think Vladimir Putin's playing at here? And is your concern, and this seems to be widely shared amongst security chiefs here in Britain, is that the more that this doesn't go to plan for Putin, the more desperate he may become, and essentially the temptation will be to inflict further damage on ordinary Ukrainians?
Well, we may be seeing this already. You already heard about what's been going on in Kharkiv, or Kharkov, as it was known as in Russia. They've been using Grad missiles. Now, they're a sort of bank of missiles. They're not guided. They're very actually low tech, but they fire off hundreds at a time. Which is mainly used to weaken an area in a battlefield so that the troops and military vehicles can charge forward. In Kharkiv, they've actually been using it against the town itself. So, as I say, there's no guidance system. It's actually been hitting apartment blocks. This sounds to me like total desperation, not just by Putin, but by the Russian forces there. Although, of course, we don't know whether they're actually the Russian forces who've done that or whether it's their proxy forces in the eastern Ukraine. But either way, it just shows it's not a planned attack.
And we know that I think the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenaries, may be operating in Kiev as well. Thank you very much indeed. Michael Fabricant, our Conservative MP, joining us in the studio, a man who knows Russia, it must be said, and Ukraine very well indeed. Well, let's move on now to Belarus, actually, of course, the neighbouring country to Ukraine and to Russia, where those talks have been taking place on the border. And US officials have claimed that Belarus is planning to join in on Russia's invasion of Ukraine as soon as today, just as the regime there says it will potentially host Russian weapons. Belarus has also been used throughout the invasion of Ukraine as a launch pad for attacks by Russian forces. Well, this afternoon, negotiators from both sides in the conflict have been meeting on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. It comes as in the last few hours, the United States said it is suspending the operations of its embassy in Minsk. Well, joining me now is the Belarusian journalist Hanna Lubakova, who joined us from Minsk, I believe. Hanna, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Just bring us up to date with what has happened in the last day or so there when it comes to the Belarusian parliament, suggesting that once again nuclear weapons could be based and placed on Belarusian soil.
So what's important here, yesterday the sham referendum took place in Belarus, and this referendum would bring the change to the constitution of our country, which actually deprives us of this neutrality and nuclear-free status. And this is a very dangerous development again, because Lukashenko threatened the international community that he can deploy nuclear weapons anytime in Belarus if he and Putin decide so. So now we see that he also threatened Ukraine with sending Belarusian troops to fight against Ukrainians on the side of Russians. It hasn't been clear yet. We don't have evidence whether this happened, but in a very worrying development, the Belarusian Defense Ministry now announced this training all across the country of Belarusian servicemen. What about Belarusians? People are against the war, and people are against Belarus participation in this war, and they support Ukrainians. Yesterday, protests took place all over the country, and people, despite brutal repressions, were protesting in support of Ukraine, in support of peace, and 800 people have been detained. This is the latest information, but still people in Belarus showed that they are against the war and that they are against Lukashenko and the regime.
And just in regards to these talks that are happening on the border, on the Belarusian border with Ukraine, is there any hope that they could be viewed as successful?
It is very hard to predict, because let's remember that Belarus is actually an aggressor as well, because it provided infrastructure and the territory for aggression for Russian troops. So it seems very sort of uncertain as to the result of these talks, and we don't have a lot of information yet. The Ukrainian delegation arrived a few hours ago, so these conversations continue. Yesterday, President Zelensky of Ukraine said that he does not expect much from these talks, from these conversations. But again, I understand Ukrainians here because they need to do anything possible to stop the war and bring about peace to their country and stop the killing of civilians in Ukraine.
Okay, Hanna Lubakova, thank you so much indeed for joining us there with the situation, of course, in Belarus, which is a country that neighbours, of course, both Ukraine and Russia. Should be said, in the last couple of minutes in Parliament, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is saying that an additional 100,000 Ukrainians will be able to come to the UK with access to work and public services. So the Home Secretary there saying that an additional 100,000 Ukrainians will be able to come to the UK to access work and public services, given, of course, what is happening in Ukraine. Well, we're going to hear from the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, who's also going to be in the Commons in just a couple of minutes. That and much more after this quick commercial break. Stay tuned.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here.
Joe Biden walking out.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back. 27 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Monday afternoon. Thank you for your company here on GB News. GB Views at gbnews.uk. If you've got any view on what we're covering today, of course, dominated by what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, we're going to hear from the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, in the Commons in just a couple of minutes. But let's first switch to Germany, where the Chancellor there, Olaf Scholz, launched a dramatic change to defence policy over the weekend. Germany will now spend more than 2% of its GDP on its military and has agreed to provide lethal aid to the Ukrainian army. It comes as the EU has also pledged to provide Ukraine with additional weaponry. Joining me now is a reporter, Thomas Sparrow, who is in Berlin for this afternoon. Thomas, this was a very, very significant moment for German foreign and defence policy yesterday. What sparked it, do we think? Lots of suggestions that the Germans feel that they were simply lied to by Moscow.
This has to be one of the most remarkable shifts in foreign and defense policy here in Germany for a very long time. It's been really a remarkable week. It began with Germany freezing Nord Stream 2, that gas pipeline, $11 billion gas pipeline, which links Russia to Germany. It then continued with Germany changing its long-standing policy of not supplying weapons to conflict zones. Now, it is not only going to supply weapons to Ukraine via third countries like the Netherlands, but also directly from its own stocks. And then Olaf Scholz, in that speech before Parliament on Sunday, which in itself is a strange thing here in Germany to have a session on Sunday, announced that Germany would increase its defense spending beyond 2%. Now, you may remember that US presidents from Barack Obama to Donald Trump had put pressure for Germany to reach that goal. And now Olaf Scholz simply stated that Germany would go even beyond that 2%. Now, you ask, what spurred that? Why is the reason behind that? On the one hand, Germany has argued that this is a new era and that as a new era, they have to react differently. One of the reasons why Germany had not given Ukraine weapons before is because it thought that it would damage the possibility of finding a diplomatic solution. But obviously, diplomacy has failed in this case, so Germany believes that it has to change tack. But it also has to do very clearly with strong pressure from Germany's European allies. Only at the weekend, the Polish leader was here, and before he met Olaf Scholz, he stressed that he was in Berlin to shake Germany's conscience. So very strong words there. So it's a mixture of both pressure from the EU and at the same time Germany believing that this is a new era. It means Germany has to react differently.
And Thomas, also a significant moment for the European Union that it is going to use its budgets to buy weapons to supply to Ukraine, something the EU has never, ever even contemplated, I think, in the past, let alone decided to do.
That is also another remarkable change in the last few hours. The EU has been criticized time and time again for its lack of unity in different cases. But I would say that in this particular case, the EU has moved rather swiftly, not only when it comes to those different sanction packages against Russia, but also when it comes to moves like this that I think observers thought were not going to happen in the EU very quickly and significantly not for this particular conflict. So altogether, this is really turning into many changes, both here in Germany, but also at an EU level when it comes to dealing with this conflict in Ukraine.
Thomas, as always, appreciate your analysis and your time here on GB News. Thomas Sparrow there joining us from Berlin. Well, as I say, we are going to hear from the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss in the Commons in the next couple of minutes, an update on the sanctions Britain is imposing on Russia. But let's go now to Tom Harwood, who's our political correspondent who joins us outside Parliament. As you can see, Tom, good afternoon to you. Before we hear Liz Truss, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, has been on her feet in the Commons in the last hour or so amid what seems like a significant announcement about Ukrainian refugees, that some will be able to come here and get work and seek public services.
Yes, it's a bit of a step forward, although I have to say I think that some Conservative MPs may be questioning whether this goes far enough. There is around 77% in the latest YouGov poll support for Ukrainian refugees to come to the UK visa-free. Many people think that different rules should apply to specifically Ukrainian refugees. They're sort of from this part of the world. Most of them are women and children, with the men staying behind to fight, and of course the hope is that they will return to Ukraine once this ghastly period is over. So that might be influencing public opinion, which seems to be different in terms of Ukrainian refugees than it is with regard to refugees from some other conflict areas in the world. Maybe because it seems like it might be a viable situation that people will be able to move back in maybe a few years' time, particularly if Russia is defeated in perhaps not the short term militarily, the long term through this becoming a protracted guerrilla conflict, and of course the Russian economy being worn down. So yes, broad public support for a big migration package. Will what Priti Patel has announced, not in great detail, it has to be said, in the House of Commons today, will that be enough? I think that remains an open question, although it was interesting, 100,000 people, it does sound like a big number. Will that be enough to persuade people that the government has acted here? Because of course in so many other areas, as I'm sure we'll be hearing from the Foreign Secretary in a few moments' time, the UK has been going beyond what other countries have gone, particularly with regard to the issues with SWIFT, international payment system, and Russia's access to that. I know there's a meeting of G7 leaders this afternoon where the Prime Minister will be encouraging all G7 countries to go beyond where they have already gone, where a few Russian banks have been cut out of SWIFT, where the Prime Minister is pushing for all Russian financial institutions to be cut out of SWIFT. That's something that many EU countries have so far been reluctant to do, but it is interesting how far particularly Germany and other countries have moved in the last 24 hours. Yesterday was such a key day with diplomatic moves, particularly in Europe. It's been quite incredible today to see, for example, Switzerland, famously neutral Switzerland, even going some way to mirror the EU's sanctions package against Russia. A pretty extraordinary seismic move there. Countries like Sweden exporting arms to Ukraine, and of course Germany's about to turn on its foreign policy as well. Potentially, just potentially, there'll be a further move now with European countries following the UK's lead on completing that SWIFT move. But of course, there's so much else that the Ukrainians are asking for. On my programme earlier today, I spoke to a Ukrainian MP who wanted a total oil and gas embargo on Russia from the West. Now, I have to say, I think that seems a little bit unlikely given that 40% of Europe's gas comes from Russia, but clearly a lot of international solidarity with the Ukrainian people and a lot more that Ukraine is asking for.
Yeah, indeed. And just on that point about the Home Secretary not necessarily filling out in full detail the announcement on Ukrainian refugees, opposition MPs are calling essentially, I think, for her, and this has been backed up by the Speaker, to come and make a statement in the Commons tomorrow rather than announcing it during topical questions, so they get a chance to properly ask her questions about that. So we may well see Priti Patel back in the Commons tomorrow, Tom. And as you've rightly pointed out, Switzerland this afternoon, I think it's going to come in at 5 p.m. at GMT, so that's our time, essentially Punchy saying that it is going to freeze Russian assets, thought to be worth around $11 billion in its banks, which is a pretty incredible move by Switzerland. Let's just focus on Liz Truss herself, though. We're going to hear from her in the next couple of minutes in the Commons. She's been somewhat of the controversy, though, in the last 24 hours about comments that she made on the TV yesterday.
She certainly has been. The Foreign Secretary seems to almost encourage or support the idea that former British servicemen could go out to Ukraine in order to fight with the Ukrainian armed forces, as some in Ukraine have been asking and suggesting that former British service people do. It seems that the government is reluctant to back up that call. Government sources have even suggested to me that it might be illegal in UK law for people to take up arms in another country. There's a bit of ambiguity there, but in this area it does seem like particularly the Ministry of Defence is being a lot stronger in terms of pointing along to that travel advice issued by the Foreign Office that people should not be travelling to Ukraine. Indeed, the Prime Minister's official spokesman earlier today pointed journalists to that line, that no one should be travelling to Ukraine. It does seem that the Foreign Secretary on that issue is more isolated.
And just finally, Tom, before we do hopefully cross over to the Commons, we're expecting the Prime Minister to go on his travels again this week as the diplomacy and the very obvious show of support continues from him and indeed the British government.
Indeed, he'll be flying out to Poland and some of those Baltic countries tomorrow as well, in a show of support, really, because, of course, the United Kingdom has been providing a lot of troops to those countries that are in NATO, bolstering NATO's eastern flank to try and stop this becoming a domino effect, really. There are real fears in the region that if Putin is successful in biting off Ukraine, he will then go to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia and beyond. Of course, he has this view of spheres of influence and a really quite imperial mindset in terms of where Russia should be and what land Russia should have control or influence over. And it does have to be said that although the Ukrainian troops are fighting very valiantly, and although the Russian advance is certainly a lot slower and more difficult than I think many within Moscow were expecting, they are still advancing, just more slowly than they would have thought or liked. So it is the sad truth that Russia is still advancing through Ukraine, and were they to take that country, perhaps not in incredibly short order, perhaps not in lightning war, but after a protracted struggle.
OK, Tom, I'm just going to interrupt you there because we're going to go straight to the Commons where the Foreign Secretary is making a statement to MPs.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I want to update the House on our support for Ukraine in the face of Putin's premeditated, pre-planned and barbaric invasion. Ukraine has suffered horrific attacks. Missiles and airstrikes have torn through apartment blocks. Tanks have rolled into once peaceful cities. Innocent people, including children, have lost their lives. The situation is fluid, but as of today, Putin has not taken any major cities. Their advance has been slowed by Ukraine's fierce resistance. Putin's invasion is not proceeding to plan. He expected to take cities quickly. He expected Ukraine to retreat, and he expected the West to be divided. Instead, his forces were met by the heroism of President Zelensky and the resolute determination of the Ukrainian people. He has been met by a united West, together with our friends around the world, and we have taken decisive action. Today, we have acted with the US, the EU, Japan and Canada to cut Russia's central bank off from our markets. The ruble has fallen by over 40% as a result. As much as $250 billion have been wiped off the Russian stock market, and today their stock market is closed. The EU, Germany, Sweden and others are following our lead in providing defensive weapons to Ukraine. Germany has frozen Nord Stream 2. Putin has been confounded by our collective response. That is why he is resorting to more and more extreme rhetoric. But of course, the situation remains dire. The government and people of Ukraine are facing a continued onslaught. The days ahead are likely to prove tougher still. The UK and our allies will have to undergo some economic hardship as a result of our sanctions. But our hardships are nothing compared to those endured by the people of Ukraine. Casualty numbers are rising, and over 300,000 people have already been displaced. This is a struggle for Ukraine's freedom and self-determination, but it is also a struggle for freedom and democracy everywhere, and for a survival of a Europe whole and free. We feel a particular responsibility, as the UK is a signatory to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which provided Ukraine with security guarantees. This premeditated invasion, in violation of international law and multiple international commitments, cannot succeed. Putin must lose. We are doing everything we can to stop him and to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We will do this by backing Ukraine against unjustified aggression, by degrading the Russian economy and stopping it funding Putin's war machine, and by isolating Putin on the world stage. First of all, we're backing Ukraine with defensive weapons, humanitarian aid and economic support. The UK was the first European nation to send defensive weapons to the country. Those weapons are being used today to halt Russian tanks and defend Ukrainian towns and cities. Our latest consignment of defensive support left Brize Norton over the weekend. We're also leading on humanitarian support. Yesterday, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced a further 40 million of humanitarian aid. This will provide Ukrainians with access to basic necessities and vital medical supplies. We call on Russia to enable humanitarian access and safe passage for civilians to flee the violence. The UK is also supporting Ukraine's economy, including through 100 million of ODA and guarantees of up to $500 million in development bank loans. Secondly, we are cutting off funding for Putin's war machine. We're coming together with the US, the G7 and the EU to take further decisive steps. We've been joined by Australia, Singapore, Switzerland and many more. There is a growing list of countries who are determined that this aggression cannot stand. We've agreed many Russian banks will be removed from the SWIFT system, kicking them out of international finance. This is the first step towards a total SWIFT ban. Our collective action against Russia's central bank will prevent them from deploying their international reserves to mitigate the impact of our sanctions. We're also launching a joint task force to hunt down the assets of oligarchs hit by our sanctions. The UK is proud to lead by example. We've already put in place the largest package of sanctions in our history. We've sanctioned Putin and Lavrov, Russia's defence industry, and a growing list of oligarchs. We've approved asset freezes on several Russian banks. We're banning Russian airlines and private jets from our airspace. But we are determined to go much, much further. We want a situation where they can't access their funds, their trade can't flow, their ships can't dock, and their planes can't land. Today, I can inform the House I will be laying 2 new pieces of sanctions legislation. The first introduces a set of new powers against Russia's financial sector. It includes powers to prevent Russian banks from clearing payments in sterling. With over 50% of Russian trade denominated in dollars or sterling, our coordinated action with the United States will damage Russia's ability to trade with the world. And as soon as this legislation comes into force, we will apply it to Sberbank, Russia's largest bank. I will also be imposing a full asset freeze on 3 further banks, VEB, Russia's National Development Bank, Sovcombank, the 3rd largest privately owned financial institution in Russia, and Ozkriter, one of Russia's largest commercial banks. We will bring in a full asset freeze on all Russian banks in days, looking to coordinate with our allies. This same legislation will prevent the Russian state from raising debt here, and it will isolate all Russian companies, that's over 3 million businesses, from accessing UK capital markets. Global giants like Gazprom will no longer be able to issue debt or equity in London. The second piece of legislation will ban exports to Russia across a range of critical sectors. This includes high-end technological equipment such as microelectronics, marine and navigation equipment. This will blunt Russia's military-industrial capabilities and act as a drag on Russia's economy for years to come. I appreciate the consequences of this step for British people and British businesses operating in Russia, and the Department of International Trade and the Treasury will offer advice and guidance to affected UK businesses. My consular staff will continue to support British nationals in Russia, as well as those in Ukraine. And we will keep ratcheting up our response. More legislation will follow in coming weeks in sanctioning Russian-occupied territories in the Donbass, extending more sanctions to Belarus, and limiting Russian deposits in UK banks. We will continue working through our hit list of oligarchs, focusing on their houses, their yachts, and every aspect of their lives. In addition, we will be introducing the Economic Crime Bill tomorrow. My Right Honourable friend, the Business Secretary, will be setting out more in the next statement in the House. This is all about flushing out the oligarchs' dirty money from the United Kingdom. And we will continue to work with our G7 allies to cut off the Russian economy and cut the free world's dependence on Russian gas, depriving Putin of his key source of revenue. Finally, we're leading the diplomatic effort to ensure there is a chorus of condemnation against President Putin. In the OSCE, a key part of the European security architecture, 45 countries condemn Russia by name. At the UN Security Council on Friday, over 80 UN members voted for or co-sponsored a resolution condemning Russia's aggression. Russia stood alone in opposing it. Putin is isolated. No one is willing to back his war of choice. In recent days, I've spoken to my counterparts in more than 20 countries around the world. Yesterday, I met G7 foreign ministers, where we were joined by Ukraine's brave foreign minister, my friend Dmytro Kuleba. Everyone is clear Putin must lose, and we will carry on increasing the pressure until he does. We have all seen Ukraine's determination to fight. Putin's war could end up lasting for months and years. So I say to our Ukrainian friends, we're with you. In Britain and around the world, we're prepared to suffer economic sacrifices to support you. However long it takes, we will not rest until Ukraine's sovereignty is restored. I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement and for the continued briefing that she continues to give me on Privy Council terms. We have all been inspired by the gallant and tenacious actions of Ukrainians in defence of their country. This is true courage under fire. President Zelensky has epitomised the bravery, the dignity and resolve of a nation fighting back, fighting for values that we all share, for democracy, for freedom and for the rule of law. The Foreign Secretary is right when she says that Putin's invasion is not so far going to plan. But will she agree with me that we must not let our focus slip for even a second? We will continue to stand united with our allies and partners, supporting Ukraine and opposing this outrageous campaign of aggression. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had the honour of meeting with Ukraine's ambassador with the Shadow Defence Secretary. He thanked all sides of this House for the united opposition that we have shown to Vladimir Putin's illegal war and the support we continue to show for Ukrainian sovereignty. Putin is not only facing a united West, he is facing a truly united kingdom. Together, we have enacted sanctions that are having a strong effect. The ruble has crashed by over 40%. The main borrowing rate is up 20%, and inflation is reportedly hitting around 65% per year. Oligarchs are being frozen out of their bank accounts, and the Central Bank of Russia is being blocked from part of the 640 billion war chest that it holds in foreign reserves. Labour's priority is to cut off Putin's rogue state from our economic system and to undermine his campaign of aggression in Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, we recognise that on the 24th of February, the European security order changed. Our continent faces a transformed strategic context. Our world is at the start of a new era. I pay tribute to the political courage shown by all of our partners, particularly our allies in Germany, who have recognised that by taking the difficult and brave decisions to provide Ukraine with lethal weapons for its fight and to commit to the significant increases in defence spending that this new reality demands. Yesterday, President Putin raised the alert level of Russian nuclear forces. Mr. Speaker, as the 5 nuclear weapons states, including Russia, reaffirmed in January, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Can I ask for her assessment of this decision, given the understandable concern it will have caused amongst the public? Turning to sanctions, we welcome the further steps the government has announced today. The progress made by the UK, the EU and the US on cutting off Russian banks from SWIFT is something Labour has called for some time. The moves to finally clamp down on dirty money, so long demanded by Labour and colleagues across the House, are long overdue. It's regrettable that it's taken this long and a crisis of this nature for action, but we welcome the steps and will study them carefully. But there's still more the government can do. The last time I stood at this dispatch box, I asked what steps the government has taken to ensure members of Russia's legislature, the Duma, can be sanctioned. Still today, I'm waiting for that answer. Similarly, while I welcome the Foreign Secretary's action against Russia's financial sector, the government should go further.
There you go. That is David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, speaking in the Commons. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, before that, saying that this was a struggle for freedom and democracy everywhere and that Putin must lose, and we're doing everything we can to stop him. She said that Vladimir Putin had been confounded by the West's collective response. That is why he's resorting to more and more extreme rhetoric. We should also just say that within the last hour or so, the French President Emmanuel Macron has had a phone call with Vladimir Putin, lasted for 90 minutes, in which the French President reiterated the international community's demand that Russia halt its offensive against Ukraine and reaffirmed the necessity of immediately establishing a ceasefire. That's not likely to happen, but that the Russian president would stay in touch in the coming days. Let's get some final thoughts now with Liam Hannigan, our economics editor, who's in the studio. Liam, thank you for joining us. Just in terms of what's happened in Russia today, we've seen people queuing up at ATMs. The currency has hit a new low, interest rates at a record high.
Well, the Russian population is well used to currency collapses. There have been several since the end of the Soviet Union. But I think a lot of the Russian public thought that the Russian economy, the capitalist society they've built, was beyond that. But now we know that's not the case. It really is an extraordinary step for the Western powers, including Switzerland, famously neutral Switzerland.
And Japan, we hear, to a degree as well.
Indeed, to sanction the Russian central bank, to try and take away Vladimir Putin's ability, as Foreign Secretary Liz Truss just said there in the Commons, to use his war chest, his huge foreign exchange reserves, to try and offset the implications of these sanctions. But, you know, this is causing pain on the home front, if you like. I don't think it's tasteless to say that. War is always about not just military conflict and humanitarian fallout, it's about economics as well. And it seems clear to me, Darren, maybe you've been thinking about this too as our political editor, that the government will have to take steps here in the UK to help ordinary households, particularly low-income and vulnerable households, to deal with the increase in fuel prices, be it petrol, diesel,
which
household,
I think petrol is a new high today.
Utility bills, that this is now going to engender. You've got organisations like the RAC warning about £2 a litre on the forecourts. We're currently at an average, an all-time high of about £1.53. I filled up my car yesterday, it cost £100. Now, that seems ridiculous to talk about that when you've got a humanitarian crisis. But in the end, these are the factors that weigh on the minds of Western democratically elected politicians to take voters with them as this crisis escalates.
Liam, thank you very much indeed. Liam Halligan, our economics editor, with his analysis. And that is it for the briefing for today. I'll be back, of course, at 3 o'clock tomorrow. Liam, we'll be back at 1 on the money. Up next, it is Colin Brazier from 4 to 6. But first, let's go to Exeter and the Met Office for the weather. See you tomorrow.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGiffin. It's turned into a damp and, in some places, rather wet afternoon, and that rain continues to move southeast through the rest of the day, heavy at times before eventually clearing. It won't clear everywhere, it is slowing down as it approaches the southeast corner, but for much of the country, drier and clearer conditions are going to spread in from the north and the west, and for much of Scotland, Northern Ireland, a few showers. At first, at least. But the rain, by this stage, into the evening and early hours of Tuesday, is beginning to stall across East Anglia and the southeast. Light outbreaks of rain and drizzle here, but with enough cloud cover in the southeast to keep temperatures up at 7 or 8 Celsius. Meanwhile, clearer skies and lighter winds elsewhere mean a fairly widespread frost for the northern half of the country, 0 to -4 Celsius in places. 1 or 2 freezing fog patches first thing as well, but actually plenty of sunshine for North Wales, North Midlands, northwards. A few more blustery showers to come for the far north and west of Scotland. Otherwise, for much of the UK, it's dry, it's bright, 8 or 9 Celsius in the north, 9 to 11 in the south, but for southern counties of England, for South Wales, generally M4 corridor southwards, the afternoon turns fairly damp as the next front moves in from the southwest, and the rain turns persistent for a time during Tuesday night for southwest England, for much of Wales, light on and off outbreaks of rain for central and southern England and for Northern Ireland. But for Scotland, it stays clear, and that means another frosty start on Wednesday, but a bright blue skies start the day for much of Scotland. The breeze picks up in the north and the west through the day. Winds almost touching gale force for exposed parts of the Western Isles, and then the cloud and the rain in the south move north. And I think Thursday also looks like a cloudy and damp day, but the sunshine returns for the weekend.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi, they're coming up in the next 60 minutes for you. Peter Hitchens tells us how the West may have missed the chance to make allies of Russia when we had that chance. Also, Colonel Richard Kemp on whether now is the time for Britain to have its own anti-ballistic missile shield. And our debate today. Are we ready for a rerun of the Cold War? The former Sun editor Kelvin Mackenzie takes on Carol Turner of CND, plus the latest on when COVID masks will finally be ditched in the corridors of schools in Scotland. But first, we'll bring you the headlines.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 4. I'm Miranda Shunker in the GB newsroom. The Foreign Secretary says Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion is not proceeding to plan. Speaking in the Commons in the last half hour, Liz Truss said that the UK will impose further sanctions against Moscow following its invasion of Ukraine. She told MPs the US, the EU,